Okay, fantastic. So, we were chatting about, yeah, I think I was saying that, like, uh, here's why my view is not ideological. I mean, I mean, when someone says ideological, it's like, I mean, isn't centrism kind of is like ideological? It's
Well,
a,
I think what's an example of how do I put this? Yeah, you were kind of explaining it. Like what's an example
yeah.
of like a way that we would see that economic theory is not working, and then we would have to adjust our maybe our libertarian capitalist leanings.
Yeah, I think one example would be is like, I guess, I think you might be able to. What are some examples where I think economic theories, like current established
Like
economic
what
theories,
evidence would
fail?
you point to? Like for instance, one thing that I would point to maybe would
I
be
think, yeah,
it
sure,
seems
sure.
like
Yeah,
yeah, so like one thing that I would point to maybe, and I don't know to the extent that this would line up necessarily with economic orthodoxy, right? But like a more libertarian framework is typically very anti-government welfare, right? For one reason or another.
yeah, yeah,
And one thing that I would point to is, well, we lived in a world without welfare for a long time. It's only really in all of human government history, very
yeah,
recently when we started having these social services and stuff. And before that, that whole time, basically poverty rates were super duper high and people were really, really poor and inequality was relatively high. And then we implement these social services and these welfare programs, and then poverty goes down a ton. And that's coincided with a period of rapid economic growth and expansion, which would tell me, based on the empirical analysis and the studies, that when welfare is introduced into an economy, obviously in a relatively efficient way, you end up with basically people being able to live up to their fullest talents. Whereas, a kid who lives in a poor town with polluted water and lead poisoning and stuff, like that's a kid that's probably not going to grow up to be a rocket scientist because they're not able to live up to their full talents because of the destitution surrounding him. The government can help in a scenario like that. It sounds like what you would say is, well, while it might be the case that there are anti-poverty effects to this program in a data sense, like you can just look at it and see that that happens, there are other costs that we just maybe aren't considering that this program has, and those costs are probably worse than, or those costs are worse to the extent that the anti-poverty effects of these programs make these programs worth getting rid of,
yeah.
right? And that
So,
just sounds to me like, well, I just kind of think these programs are bad, but I don't necessarily have a good thing that I can point to prove that, right? And that's kind of unsatisfying from my perspective.
yeah, yeah, that's understandable. That's understandable. So here's why I think it's fantastic that you brought welfare, right? Because here's an interesting thought, right? Like you had a chat with Alex Norasta on immigration, and you also
Yeah.
talked about welfare. And I think
Mhm.
Alex Norasta so far has said like immigrants seem to undermine welfare, and I think also labor unions. So it's sort of like what's happening is that you you like this is an example, right, where people are not seeing the costs, right? If welfare stops or like makes it difficult, and also like labor unions make it difficult for immigrants, right, to move from their poor countries to a richer country for better well-being, right, to become rich, that's major thing. Because like in United States, like these anti-poverty programs, right, like they are only for United States. They are not for like reducing global poverty. Like the global poor are in a much more scarier situation, much more horrifying situation than I think people in the United States who are poor, right? And if welfare, you make welfare disappear right now in United States, I think the poor of the United States will still be in a better situation than the people who are like global poor in their own countries, right? So I think that's an invisible cost to people, and that's an invisible cost. And I should mention David Friedman, I think, talked about this welfare and like poverty, right? And like David Friedman's view is that at least partially, the fact that United States had a lot of economic growth from like I think 1950s, or I think 1940s. I think 1940s, 50s, like like after welfare was introduced, right? Like United States also had massive economic growth too. So David Friedman's view is that it is economic growth that led to massive reductions in poverty. And I think even our world in data, I think, shows that it was industrial revolution that led to massive reductions in poverty, right? Like it was industrial revolution. It was basically, and not only that, I think interestingly, like 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 welfare programs, like I would acknowledge that, sure, welfare programs do reduce poverty, but I think reducing poverty, i think I would better use it like it like welfare programs make poverty more palatable, I guess, right? It's like the so like it reduces poverty in the sense that, yeah, people have money now, right? They can do something with it, but it's like if it makes people be stuck in a welfare program, right? Be stuck in a welfare program, and they are not able to get a job, right? Like there are like some perverse incentives. They are unable to contribute properly. I think that seems like an inefficiency, right?
Mhm.
So I think so. Yeah, I will say like these three things are
Yeah.
important here. Yeah.
I think, yeah, but I think that the problem is like even conceptually, that's probably not true. And I'll just say it's definitely not true. And it'll kind of make more sense as I explain. So yeah, like David Friedman and a lot of libertarians, a very interesting debate that you should watch if you haven't. On my podcast, The Three Wonks, we had Yaron Brook who debated Matt Brunig, and I think that these are two people who I
Uh,
think they represent.
Yaron Brook, look, Yaron Brook.
Yeah,
I don't think he's good. All right, like
no,
Yaron
no,
Brook.
yeah, no, no, it's fine. I'm just
So
that argument. I think Matt Brunig outlines this argument better, probably better than I do, just because he's done it a lot more. But I think that in that debate, Matt Bruning outlines this argument, and the argument kind of goes something like this, right? Is that, well, I think actually it's economic growth that reduces poverty, right? That's the thing that reduces poverty really, really well. When you have these welfare programs, that reduces economic growth. Therefore, these welfare programs actually probably end up increasing poverty because they reduce economic growth. And there's so much baked into that. Number one, economic growth is good, obviously. I mean, it's good that we expand our economy. It typically comes with innovation. And also it comes with a sort of, you could say, like a broader consumption base that we could take advantage of. Hey, now we have whatever, like deodorant just got invented, and so now we have deodorant that we can consume, right? We used to not have that before. Now we do. That's great. Hey, a new car just came out. We used to have old crappy cars. Now we got new good cars. Pretty simple examples like that. However, that doesn't really necessarily address one of the foundational problems with, you could say, like market allocation. And this isn't like capitalism necessarily, but just market allocation in general. Even in a market socialist economy, you would still have this exact same problem, which is there's a lot of people who just aren't workers, right? And they're not workers because of welfare programs. They're not workers, or they're not workers because of just some inherent aspect of their being. There's several groups of people that fall into this bucket. These
yeah,
are the groups of people that are typically targeted for welfare programs because these are the groups of people that also make working aged people poor. There's not a lot of people who are able-bodied workers who, in and of themselves, live in incredible poverty because work does typically, I mean, for the most part, it's not as if we have entirely, a whole system of living wages and stuff. But like if we take an example, let's say you're on $35,000 a year in America, and that's not an incredible wage by any means. I think maybe the median's higher than that now. Maybe it's $40,000 a year. Let's say you're on $40,000 a year in America. It's not that that's an incredible wage, but if you're single living by yourself with no other family responsibilities, certainly we would call that a living wage because you could live on $40,000 a year, right? If you're an able-bodied working adult working full time. But that there's so much baked into that. Children can't work and don't work. We would typically say it's probably bad. I mean, libertarians, I know, debate child labor and stuff, but like typically from an intuitive perspective, we would say children working probably isn't a good thing. And typically children they're not eligible to make a lot of money anyway working. We would typically value their education more than working anyway. Number two, students, right? People in education, right? People who we would say we're making long-term investments in their human capital, maybe because we think they'd be more productive workers down the line. But a student who has to go through abject poverty while they're learning to be an engineer is probably less likely to become that productive engineer in the first place. Caregivers, right? People who just happen to have people in their lives that they have to care for, and so they don't necessarily have the time to work. They're doing productive activity. After all, someone who works as a nurse, as a caregiver, is getting
Yes.
paid, but someone who works as a caregiver for their family member is not being paid, even though they're doing the same amount of labor. Um, Old people, right? Old people
Yeah.
are less able to work, obviously, because they're elderly. Elderly people are basically
Yes.
sort of disabled in a way that they're unable to work. And then there's people who are literally disabled, people who just have intellectual or physical disabilities
Yeah.
that prevent them from working, of course. And so all of these people, right, are not really eligible for the benefits of economic growth because they're kind of operating outside of the market because for one reason or another, they just can't operate within the market, or perhaps more importantly, they shouldn't. We shouldn't probably expect people with disabilities to have to go get a job, especially if they're just disabled, right? And they can't work. And so economic growth is good, but it's not really something that's ever it could ever possibly be expected to really just solve poverty in and of itself. We kind of need government institutions to solve that problem for us because market distribution is not really concerned with non-market actors, and these are non-market actors that I'm talking about.
Okay, okay, fantastic. That's fantastic, right? I so with respect to education, right? Like student education, like child education. I think Brian Kaplan says that the like education is in like education overall, I think like Brian Kaplan says, is overrated, right? Like colleges, and like I think even up to totally like K-12. I think Brian Kaplan only supports like up to K-6, right, of education, just education. And generally Brian Kaplan also supports more child labor, right? Now, of course, intuitively, when someone hears child labor, they just think of like children working in like hazardous conditions and stuff like that. I mean, and like children suffering and stuff like that. So I mean, look, that's intuitive, sure. Sure, it is bad if the child is working in like a horrible workplace, like some kind of construction work, hazardous conditions, right, and stuff like that. Sure, sure. But there are certainly some forms of child labor that are decent, right? Like there was a time like when people were like farmers, when people were poor, like children were used in like farms, right, in like fields, right? So I mean, at least I think fields farming is, I think, relatively less hazardous to like manufacturing, direct manufacturing work, where like machines are like there are a lot of machines, you have to clean them, big machines, they use a lot of like chemicals and stuff, they need to be careful, like children, or like they will suffer a lot. So I mean, like we have to be specific of which child labor is bad and which is like decent, which is pretty good, and I think they should be allowed, right? So I think Brian Kaplan goes into specifics, right? He talks about what kind of child labor is bad, what kind of child labor is good, right, better. And when it comes to disabled people, I think like not all people are severely disabled such that uh, sorry, not all disabled people are severely disabled such that they are literally unable to work. Because I personally think that the people who are severely disabled, I think there will absolutely be private charities, and there exist private charities like Give Directly, right? Give Well, Give Directly, and Give Well. These are like private charities. I think you probably have heard of them if you are like
Yeah.
familiar with
Well,
Michael Irfan. So
yeah, but I
so
don't think that there's ever. So I think the problem with that though is that it's not that necessarily you're disabled to the point that you're um literally unable to work, right? There's also costs associated with disability, right? So for instance, like a child tax credit or a child reimbursement that gives everyone with children, some amount of money each month. It's not because I guess theoretically like children can't work. It's also because there are necessarily costs associated with bearing children that people without children don't have to bear, right? So you might get people with children extra assistance. Same thing with somebody who has a disability. For instance, if you have diabetes, you're not probabilistically speaking, somebody with diabetes isn't literally unable to work. There's millions of people who have diabetes that work every
Yeah.
day, but there are costs associated with having diabetes that
Yes.
other people don't have to bear. And so
Yes.
that type of that sort of aggregate lowering of standard of living leads to a lot of people being pushed into poverty who otherwise wouldn't be if they didn't have their disability. And so this is where non-market income is probably pretty important in pulling those people above that line and equalizing those costs.
So I mean, the thing, like, sure, there are causes that push people to poverty, but
Yeah.
right,
Well, that's
but
what I'm talking about, right? Because again, that's where the single able-bodied person who's making $40,000 a year is not in poverty.
yeah,
But if you add in, say, a disabled spouse and two children on $40,000 a year, that's a family that's living in poverty, right? Without
yeah,
any sort of
yeah.
difference in the work
Now,
of the person that's being performed.
sure, sure. So disabled wife and two children, right? Like now, suppose that the disabled, the sorry, the two children, you allow some sort of child labor for them, right? Suppose that they are able to earn something, right? Those children are also able to earn something. um, okay, let's assume they both combined are able to earn, like, per year they are able to earn $5,000, right? So the money goes from 40,000 to 45,000, right? They both combined are able to earn 5,000, right, per year. Wife, okay, now how much disabled is the wife? If the wife is severely disabled, then sure, they will be on $45,000. But it is important to note here that, remember, these people will not be paying those taxes to the welfare if the welfare does not exist, right? We are like comparing without welfare, like with welfare, these people, like women with disabilities and two children, and of course without child labor, with like current status quo basically. So 40,000, this family goes to welfare, right? Perhaps the husband does not go to welfare because he's earning, but the wife and the kids are on like some sort of welfare. They are able to get like $20,000 per year. So the family goes from like $40,000 to like $60,000 or something because of government welfare, right? Now, suppose there was no government welfare. Remember, we have to like cut taxes too, because like welfare is based like you put money into welfare through taxes, right? So there are no taxes. There are also not these unnecessary child labor laws, anti child labor laws, right? So these children are able to work somewhat, right? They are able to earn, okay, suppose $5,000. Now, how much disabled is the wife? Based on that, she'll be able to work. If she's mildly disabled, she will be able to work in certain jobs, right? Like computer science, I think, is one kind of like IT and computer science. Like these kinds of jobs, I think she can work and probably earn something, right? Even if she were like working part-time. I think suppose she's working like part-time and she's earning like $20,000, right? For part-time per year. So the family goes from like 40,000, and the children working 45,000 and the wife working 65,000, and remember, less taxes. So I think these people are richer, right? Richer in this scenario, right? So
Yeah. Well, it's not that we can't construct a scenario where people are forced into
yeah,
work from a theoretical perspective, but that's where we jump from the theoretical
to
to the
real, yeah,
empirical,
sure.
right? And
Yeah,
so when we look at the effects, and there's been at least in America, obviously, I'm not sure about many other. I mean, I know many other countries have experimented with this, but at least in America, there have been so many different experiments to try and like force people on welfare into work, having work requirements explicitly, making them search for jobs, this and that. And what we find, it seems like across all of these studies, is that these types of programs don't tend to encourage a substantial number of people into work. But what they do end up happening, in terms of an effect, is a lot of people being kicked off of their benefits because they're not able to meet their work requirements, right? And that's probably a lot worse of an impact than otherwise. Obviously, when it comes to child labor, it seems like the dearth of studies available on child labor is that not that in a vacuum, child labor is sort of necessarily bad. Oh, what's so bad about a kid? I don't know, working a counter and then making $5,000 a year or something like that. the issue is always the opportunity cost of a child's time, right? Like, is it better for a child to, be playing around with their friends and doing after school activities and, focusing on their homework, or is it better for them to be splitting their time, working part time at a restaurant or something
Brian
like that,
Kaplan looked
right?
at the studies, I think these studies, right? Like
Mhm.
opportunity cost, like what if you put the child in like full K-12 education versus you allow the child, I think, to be like after sixth or seventh grade, you allow the child into work or some trade school or like apprenticeship. And I think Brian Kaplan finds that it would be actually better if you just allow child labor. He goes into again detail,
Well,
and it's a book, by the way.
don't get me
He
wrong.
was
If we're
yeah,
caveating it to like older teenagers, like even the UK allows 16-year-olds to enter apprenticeships
not even older
when they're
teenagers. I think he would say like even after I think like sixth grade, right? Sixth grade is not I think teenager age, right? So
after sixth grade, I think is 13, at
he,
least in America.
oh, in the United
But
States, okay. I think maybe I think I don't think it's sixth grade specifically, but I do think that it's like after like I think 8 or 9 years old even. Yeah, I think it's
I don't
I don't know. Yeah. So
I'd have to review that myself. That stretches my intuitions. But
yeah, I
all
mean
that's to say though is that
yeah.
I think that um I think at the end of the day though, a lot of these programs that try to get people on welfare into work just don't tend to work. They just seem to result in a lot more people being ineligible for benefits that would otherwise help them, right? And again, we can look at the historical record of each sort of proposed alternative, right? Because we lived in a society for most of human history without very much government assistance and welfare. We saw huge poverty rates. We didn't see labor force participation substantially different, right? At least we've seen higher labor force participation. I think that on record, the highest labor force participation that we ever had in America was in the 90s. That was in at a, again during that period of expansion of welfare benefits, at least relative to the early 1900s. And so it doesn't seem like welfare causes a ton of people to leave the labor force. And again, in part, that's what's to be expected with my idea of, well, a lot of these people aren't really like labor force participants in the first place, right? And so why would we expect welfare to kick a bunch of people? Like, why would a bunch of people say, I'm going to go on welfare and stop working when most of the people affected by a welfare system aren't even people who would ordinarily be workers? And so I think that that's why you see over time this relationship of, well, welfare basically causes poverty to go down a lot, but it doesn't necessarily cause your tax base to be totally eroded because everyone jumps out of work and onto welfare. There's just never, uh, really been that much welfare available to people who are, just single able-bodied adults who otherwise just don't really need it,
I'm
right?
talking about 1950s. I think we're 1950s or 40s. Like, what time do you think was there? There was no welfare.
Well, yeah. So when it comes to welfare, there's at least in American history, I'm not sure about other countries, there were kind of two periods of great welfare expansion that I'm familiar with. There was basically under FDR, where you start to get Social Security and income
Yeah.
security, broadly, and then you get the war on poverty under LBJ, where you get,
Oh,
I believe, Medicaid, Medicare, and maybe food stamps as
so F,
well.
so
A bunch
FD.
of a whole other slew of welfare programs. And so I guess pre-FDR would really be the period that I'm thinking of.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. But I mean, look, even in 1930s, okay, there was substantial poverty. Okay. Okay. So I have to look at the data and like what like how many people were poor and like what are the reasons
Sure.
that they were poor, because I mean econoboi, I mean like in 1920s and 30s there was like the Great Depression and all sorts of like strange things were happening, right? So I mean like World War I happened, right? I mean come on, so I mean it's like that's the thing, right? I mean
Well,
there was some
even you could look
horrible,
even before then, right? I mean, like
yeah,
from 19, from FDR, obviously World War II was happening, but then when
yeah,
we had the Social Security, for instance, World War II was happening, but poverty still went down amongst the elderly community after Social Security was implemented. That was during World War II, presumably a bigger conflict than World War One, and then
yeah,
that's through Vietnam, the Korean War, the Iraq, all these different sort of domestic conflicts through COVID. We had lower poverty rates during COVID than we
yeah,
had
but I think
in the early 1900s.
Milton Friedman proposed that FDR made Great Depression actually like prolonged the Great Depression, right? Like I think Milton Friedman said that like FDR's programs did prolong Great Depression. I mean, sure, I will acknowledge that he did reduce poverty, right? Like, sure, if you give people money, that will be helpful to them. I'm not denying that at all. If you give people unemployment benefits, that will be beneficial to them, right? Like of course, like worker unions benefit the workers who are in the union, right? So I mean,
Sure.
like that's clear, right? I'm not going to deny that stuff, but it's like the overall like effects, right, on other stuff, right, like second order, third
Sure.
order, like fourth order effects. So I mean, it's like I think I don't know if it's the economic consensus or not, but I did see, but I do hear that FDR's programs, like right, like what FDR did, like prolonged the Great
Mhm.
Depression, right? So I mean, it's like, and I mean, like World War I, World War II, like I'm talking about before welfare, right? So World War I happened before welfare, and like before FDR, like after World War I and before FDR, I think there was also like Great Depression happened. That also like I think pushed a lot of people into poverty, right? So I mean, and even before World War I, if we look at before World War I, 1916, before 1914, I think. So it's like, okay, you would say between like 1870s to 1914, there was like a lot of poverty. I guess, yeah, I guess I would agree with that. But I mean, look, Industrial Revolution literally happened around 18th and 19th century, right? So I mean, like it was like the effects of Industrial Revolution were like much more, I think, initial, I guess. Like initial, like it was like Industrial Revolution, I guess, was in initial stage, initial to moderate stage around that time, right? Like even before 1914, right? So I mean, it's like, yeah, I mean, like, but like, so yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. I think, yeah, we will have to just look at the data. I think
Gotta look at it.
someday I would love to, maybe research stream like with you, like how Destiny does, like
Sure.
maybe we'll do research stream someday, maybe in the
Well, yeah,
future.
I guess
Yeah,
I gotta
but
head out soon, but
yeah,
anything else you wanted to talk about real quick before we hang up here?
um, no, I'm just going to, I think, stop recording. By the way, stick around. I want your like feedback after this, after I stop recording. And by the
Sure.
way, thank you, econoboi. Like I really, really appreciate you, man. I think you, Pisco, Hutch, Destiny, you all have been doing great work. I'm a libertarian capitalist, but I still think that you are doing fantastic work. And like Destiny, I think convinced me that J6 and like Trump's criminal immunity, and like Destiny, and like he convinced me that Trump is going to be really bad for
Yeah.
United States, and also I think for the world, really. Like his 10% tariffs, on
Mhm.
like all
Yeah.
stuff, that will, like, I'm an Indian. I currently live in India, so
Mhm.
I mean, that stuff is like scary stuff, I mean, and his policy seems scary. I think
Yeah.
he's very, very not a libertarian capitalist.
Yeah.
He does not care that much about economy, it
Yeah.
seems. Uh, so yeah, okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.